So let me share my screen and then maybe we can start with the webinar. Well, good morning, Luam. Good morning, afternoon or evening to all interested listeners of today. This lecture is organized and provided by the Center for African Smart Public Value Governance. My name is Metkel Yosiev, and I am a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Law of the University of Bern. Today, Professor Luam Drar will tell us more about the norms of solidarity and regionalism among Southern African states. Before we dive into your presentation, Luam, let me first introduce the center to our listeners. So, as an independent organization, the Center for African Smart Public Value Governance, short CASP, has two missions, a practical one and a theoretical one. The practical mission is to encourage African public sector organizations in being prepared to tackle today's and tomorrow's complex problems by supporting them in their cultural and technological transformation under consideration of their local context. So by combining different disciplines, CASP, the intent of CASP is to strengthen public sector organizations' effectiveness and smartness as public problem solvers. On the other hand, the center's theoretical mission is to establish a platform that allows new approaches in the development of theories in organization studies and public management. So for this purpose, we have the three scholars. Probably some of you have already heard of them now. These are Dr. Emamdine Fahim from the University of Bern and two from the Middlesex University Mauritius, Dr. Amar Seam and Dr. Adila Kodabooks. They are currently, so Dr. Adila Kodabooks is currently in Florida. So they teamed up and founded the center. 2 years ago, in the initial phase, the center has prepared and organized a webinar series and workshops. These webinars and workshops with scholars working on issues about public management with African context. They have professionals also from African public sectors organizations, but also students that were interested in these topics. This was the starting point that was provided for the center. So topics such as current challenges for African public sector organizations, as well as potential solutions to tackle them have been discussed. Based on these insights of these webinars, the three founding members of CASP have published a paper in which they conclude that the discussion revealed, one, that smart public value governance is a promising approach to tackle grand challenges. And the second, that local particularities might hamper the implementation of smart public value governance approaches in African countries. And the third, that it exists a necessity to listen deeply to Africa. So, and this is exactly what we have done in the past, what we want to do today and in the near future. So two lectures, one by Dr. Doreen van Noren, about African Ubuntu and Sustainable Development Goals, and one by Dr. Toussaint Notias about facial recognition technologies in Africa, have already been presented and are also online on our website or on YouTube. And after today, there will be a fourth presentation in December by Dr. Salah Shafik and Professor Wolfgang Dressler about governing in the semi-shadow of the Global West. Today, however, we want to look at norms of solidarity and regionalism among the state behavior of Southern African states. So it is a great pleasure, dear Luam, to have you here to present your paper you have worked on and published a few years back. It is also a great honor to introduce and moderate your lecture today, not only because you are a great friend and a mentor, but also because you have an impressive CV. Currently, you are an assistant professor of law at the Western New England University in Springfield, Massachusetts. Before that, you have been working as a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Foundation for International Peace and the Rule of Law in Heidelberg, Germany, where you supported African governments in transition on the rule of law and lawmaking processes from a comparative perspective. But besides that, you have also research and teaching experience that span Harvard University, Cornell University, Pretoria University, Doha Educational City. So, and not last, also you have been to the University of Tanzania. So you have consulted international organizations on migration as a subject matter and as a country expert. I could go on and on about all you have done and achieved so far, but knowing how humble you are and pragmatic you are, I believe it is time we dive into today's presentation. And for any further information about CASP, the webinars, the lectures series, or any feedback or collaborations, you can contact us on our website at any time. Dear Luam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Metkal, for the very generous introduction. I want to thank you, Dean, Amar, and Adelia, sorry for mispronouncing your name, and CASP for bringing us all together and for giving me an opportunity to present my work. This work that I present today builds on an article that I wrote a few years back and that tried to look at how Southern African states behave towards each other. And I tried to develop a theory to analyze how and when they choose to behave in a certain way, whether their reaction or action was a result of ideational concerns or rationalist self-interest maximizing behavior. I looked at their relationship within themselves, but I also looked at how they react when a third party like the European Union is negotiating with them as a group or individually bilaterally, and try to see if this relationship changes and if my theory of norms of solidarity actually holds up. After writing that and publishing that piece, today I'll be building on it and try to see how African states, specifically Southern African states, behave towards each other when it comes to climate migrants, foreign policy making towards climate migrants. This is a work in progress, this part of the work, and I welcome feedback and support on how I can enrich it better. So this work is also informed by my recent work with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, drafting the African Guiding Principles on the Rights of All Migrants. And that guiding principles was adopted by the African Commission in May of this year. And it has the first in the world engagement with climate migrants. It's a change. A lot of times when we hear about norm entrepreneurship, a lot of scholars look at Africa as a borrower. So it's nice to see that Africa is actually an entrepreneur and has been an entrepreneur in the past as well. And it's interesting that African states with their limited resources are able to set the agenda for recognition of climate migrants. So that triggered my interest to see how African states have behaved towards foreign policy making in relation to climate migrants. So before I'll structure my presentation in terms of Africa's past, present, and future. But before I delve into my presentation, I want to do two things. First, I want to state my central argument. So the central argument of this article that I'm writing is that relations among African states are defined by norms of solidarity, which combine ideational and material concerns. However, these ideational and material concerns have taken binary and divergent paths when it comes to recognition of climate-induced human mobility and domestic climate adaptation policies. Now, I want to begin by explaining of what I mean by norms of solidarity. For me, norms of solidarity stipulate and they establish standardized behavior or solidarity as a logic of appropriateness among African states. It's a pattern of thought that established state behavior by formulating the function and value of Africanness. And then you go into this question, okay, then what is Africanness? And that conception of Africanness in my work and in my reading is formulated through a process of socialization of norms of solidarity. It could be a common opposition to colonialism or colonist, but also a common concern for a cause. And that norms of solidarity, in my thinking, it helps establish the core assumptions of state behavior between African states. It creates an identity. So Africanness is not just a way, but also is an identity by itself, and a destiny for African states beyond the confines of geographic proximity. So the conception of Africanness or Pan-Africanism falls within its rubric, and it goes beyond the geography of what we consider Africa today, but to all people of African descent. And you can see this with how African states have reacted to police brutality in the United States. The African Union issued several statements. The position that African states have taken to issues of discrimination and abuse or racism against people of African descent in Europe. You can look at the work of the UN Working Group on Africa, and you see active engagement from African states in that sense, which in my thinking takes this theory beyond the geographic proximity of Africa. So Africanness or norms of solidarity, it also defines the internal structure and dynamism among African states. This is not to claim that continental feelings of Africanness originated in one part of Africa and not the other. Rather, a shared experience of colonialism and racial domination is what led to the social construction of Africanness among all African states. That's how I think about it. So norms of solidarity is rosy in the way I have described it so far, but it has its own ambivalences as well. First, norms of solidarity, it portrays post-colonial African states as virtuous. We share common rhythm, lyrics, and tune of Africanness. That's not always true, and we've seen several instances where this has not been the case. It kind of paints a popular picture of Africanness as altruistic, where concerns of other African states is overwhelmingly present. For instance, Nyerere, back in 1960s, when the African Union was being formulated, he noted how the whole of Africa speaks with one sincere voice. And that it's no doubt that all of Africa was against colonialism, and against racial discrimination. But today, for instance, in the 1994 Ken Saro-Wiwa incident in Nigeria, when Mandela or South Africa spoke up, not every African country supported South Africa. They were actually critical of South Africa, and they had this phrase to refer to South Africa as a white state with a black head, right? So it's just, I'm not painting a rosy picture. I understand that African states behave out of multiple concerns, not always out of virtuous plans. And it's very visible if you look at South Africa, for instance, in post-apartheid South Africa, 1994, Nelson Mandela, when he was president, one of the laws that was passed was how they were going to do foreign policy. So South Africa was one of the exceptional states that put human rights as a condition in their foreign activities, like their foreign engagement, foreign diplomacy engagement, but not many African states have it. Again, relations among African states look at Eritrea and Ethiopia, or even within Southern African states, Rwanda and Burundi, it's not always out of we are one people, we are Africans, or let's embrace Africanness. But there are also opposing needs, material concerns. I spoke a few years back with the former president of Botswana, Mohae, and I was asking him, when I was starting this project, I was asking him, okay, so why is Botswana resisting to negotiate as a group with the EU? And he was like, if we were to join the whole SADC group as a region and negotiate with them, then there is a possibility that our concerns might be overwhelmed by South Africa, so long as South Africa is negotiating in that region. So how do you make sure the concerns of smaller states are heard while also trying to capture the needs of bigger states like South Africa? And that creates tension between African states. The other ambivalence that I have about norms of solidarity is that norms of solidarity also, to a certain extent, legitimate authoritarian states. If we're going to support all African states because we are African, despite whatever is happening and whatever the leaders are doing in those countries, there is this degree of acknowledgement and legitimation that we are doing if we subscribe to norms of solidarity without any exceptionalities. For instance, the coup in Egypt, no one talks about it anymore. We've moved on, right? We're talking about the coup in West Africa, but Sisi came to power through a coup, and we've never had a peaceful, negotiated, or even elected transition in Egypt. So we've moved on. So it has its own legitimation aspect to it that I hope down the line African countries will introspect and will try to move beyond that. But despite its ambivalences, I still think norms of solidarity play a central role in defining foreign policy among African states. Now I want to shift gears and explain the link between climate-induced human mobility and norms of solidarity. So climate change has shaped migration in Africa, and it's without a question that most climate-induced mobility in Africa are internal displacements coupled with rather small number of cross-border mobility, but still mostly being hosted by other African states. For instance, in the mid-1980s, the Great Famine of Africa led to migration of over 300,000 Ethiopians to Sudan. And within Sudan as well, people were displaced. And the question of drought, flooding, locust invasion in East Africa, it makes the Horn of Africa in general very vulnerable. And then cyclones affected thousands of people and communities in Southern African countries, Comoros, Madagascar, Malawi, Mozambique. They've been hit by tropical cyclones, while drought has affected communities in western part of the region, Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia, and Zambia. I can go on to state examples how climate change has affected people's well-being in the region. But I'm going to, as a lawyer, I'm going to shift to the legal documents and how those legal documents protect or fail to protect the climate migrants and how that intersects. I see these laws as foreign policy affirmation of countries in the region. If there is recognition of climate migrants, I see a positive action or acknowledgement of some sort of foreign policy that is within their understanding of state behavior. So at the African Union level, the OAU in 1969 passed the Convention on the Issue of Refugees in Africa, and it addresses the impact of climate change and human mobility, but it's not a direct address. It's like an indirect one. It can be interpreted to be applicable to climate migrants. So the convention, just like the UN Convention on Refugees, it recognizes persons displaced for reasons of race, nationality, religion, membership of a particular social group or political group. But then the definition of the term refugee in the African Convention, it says it shall also apply to everyone who, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or even seriously disturbing public order. And this is where climate change is falling by interpretation. Events disturbing public order. But whether that's climate change is still debatable for scholars who are in, for Eurocentric scholars. I was trying to find a different word to explain the scholars who work on this area, but Eurocentric scholars have tried to interpret this to mean not to apply to climate migrants in a way to make Europe or other Western countries to be the norm entrepreneurs when it comes to climate migrants. Similarly, at the sub-regional level, okay, they can ignore the continental principles we have, but at the sub-regional level, we have the protocol on free movement of persons in IGAD. It clearly states and tries to protect people who are crossing borders as a result of climate change. And the other aspect is that African countries recognize refugees not as individuals, but also as a group or as a people, which is a concept that concept does not exist in Europe or in the United States or anywhere else, recognition as people, as a group. And that started in IGAD partly because of the Great Famine. So when Ethiopians went to Sudan, they were automatically granted refugee status, all 300,000 of them, without going through individual determination of their refugee status. And then the other way to look about it, how African states have tried to develop norms around norms of solidarity and recognition of climate migrants, is how the impact of colonial maps, redrawing the map of Africa and pastoralism, right? If you look at how pastoralists move across borders, there is a recognition that this community has been divided as a result of colonial boundaries, but still, for instance, the Maasai from Tanzania and Kenya, they move across borders without requiring a visa. And that ease of movement is something recognized by sub-regional treaties. The East African Economic Community relating to free movement of persons recognizes the rights of pastoralists to move across borders. And then that takes me to the question of, okay, this is what we had in Africa's past and present. What about Africa's future? So climate adaptation policies are part of the Banjul Charter that gives Africans the right to a healthy environment, adequate living standard, life and health, among others. Although norms of solidarity are intensely ideational concerns, material concerns, and particularly how African states negotiate with the EU when it comes to refugees, right? The question of how refugees, our understanding is that every refugee is going to Europe or to the West, but most of them, like I said earlier, are staying within Africa. But African countries are also using this as a negotiating bargain in their relations with the EU to possibly get more aid. And so it has that norms of solidarity, that concern to protect migrants, climate migrants that come across borders, has also now an attached material concern that doesn't necessarily come from other African states, but is being requested from Western sources. So several African states, in my understanding, have moved beyond recognition of climate-induced human mobility. And norms of solidarity have taken an interesting take on that adaptation, both in terms of adaptation, but also in terms of recognition of climate migrants in Africa. But when it comes to adaptation, so recognition of climate migrants is one thing, but when it comes to adaptation policies, several African countries tie their domestic policies to global funding opportunities, like I said earlier. This is partly the result of lack of resources to fund domestic adaptation measures, and the result of existing international law theories that emphasize legal responsibilities for states in the global north that had historically and contemporaneously have higher CO2 emissions compared to a lot of African states, right? So the responsibility, if you do a harm, there is this general understanding in international law that you will be responsible for it, or you will clean up the environmental harm. And that's what a lot of African countries are relying on. It seems to me that to understand the relationship between climate change and adaptation of norms of solidarity, it seems relevant for us to explore current trends of international, continental, and regional negotiations around the climate compact. And this is the next phase of this article that I hope to look at the role of African states, and particularly how solidarity arrangements could play a positive role for sustaining and advancing concerns of climate change. From a purely negotiation perspective, unlike the current fragmented approach we have, United African States would benefit on regional and global negotiations, right? They will have more votes, more voice. And Nkrumah eloquently summarized this like a single representation resting on the strength of the whole continent. Like if one was to have like 54 votes, would be more positive in its influence than all separate representations of the African states put together. Because they might be, if we negotiate individually, they might be able to break us up and have bilateral agreements that deny us the ability to vote in a certain way in those global or multilateral agreements. Obviously, Nkrumah's call for single representation for Africa is based on norms of solidarity, where concerns of all African states are presented in the particular negotiation platform with a combined voting power. And Nkrumah goes further to explain how just having this one voice will elevate Africa's anti-colonization movement. It has done that in the past it brought it up to the global platform. And we could use the same approach to bring concerns of climate adaptation to the global platform, again, as a united voice. But again, Africa at the moment doesn't have a common foreign policy when it comes to climate change. And then we have this fragmented negotiation syndrome where African states are negotiating individually and outside their regional groupings. For instance, in the Southern African context, negotiations fall in 4 camps. There are some negotiating under COMISA, others under EAC, some under CEMAC, some under SADC. So if those agreements are not harmonized and coherent, then that would mean either we'll have a CNN effect. By CNN effect, meaning like we will see it on TV that they got together and signed this agreement, but no implementation. Or we will have multiple agreements that don't work and that might be inconsistent, and that might lead to more fragmentation of SADC, CEMAC, COMISA, and EAC. That's the worst case scenario. It's highly likely we will have a CNN effect. So in addition to the fragmented sub-regional groupings, you can also see, like in their negotiations for trade agreements with the EU, Southern African countries are negotiating bilaterally, and some are negotiating as a group. And this, for me, brings this lingering puzzle of the role and value of norms of solidarity in contemporary Africa in general, and climate adaptation policies. In conclusion, this work is, like I said, a work in progress, and I look forward to your feedback and comments, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Luam. That was very insightful. Just for those who tuned in a little bit late, let me just summarize a bit what you said, that norms of solidarity is for you, is something that you say is based in Africanness, a way or an identity, but it is not only restricted to Africa as a continent, but also to people of African descent. They can relate to these Africanness. And this is, however, hampered, or there are tensions because of material interests that are created between African states, and also between the global north and south, like the division. So, and that has also an impact on climate-induced mobility, meaning climate migrants, meaning that you are looking at it from the perspective of law and like the legal foreign policy in that sense. And you mentioned, and that's very interesting, that the impact actually also in interpreting these norms that are actually established by African members, African member states, it comes from you said it, Eurocentric worldview, and that has also an impact on Africa's future, meaning that climate migrants and there is a norm of solidarity within African countries because most of the migrants remain on the African continent, and they try to find solutions. They can move actually sometimes also freely between countries, like also pastoralism, and that this has actually a high value on the continent. So material concerns also, their impact actually, because there's a lack of resources. How can you handle like also now with other not only climate-induced mobility, but also because of conflicts that have consequences of mobility. So there is a lack of a common foreign policy, and with regards to climate-induced migration. And you believe still that that the norms of solidarity can actually bring these African member states together, and they can actually tap into this Africanness to find solutions beyond these problems that they have with regard of resources. If that's about how I can summarize it just shortly what you said, and we can open up for questions and discussions. If anyone has any question yet or anything that is unclear, Luam is now there. She can give you full answers and responses to all the questions. But if not, I have some questions that I actually want to raise. On the one hand, before we dive into the climate aspect, I also wanted to ask with regard to the African, I don't know if you have looked at it, but the African Continental Free Trade Area, and also the move, like, is that not also a common foreign policy based on somehow solidarity, where they come together and say we want a common solution and goal for like economic voice on the world, where we can say, hey, we want our own free trade area. We want to have more Africa intra-trade and not only bilateral agreements with European or Western countries in general. What do you think about that, and how do you see that before we dive into also questions of climate induced mobility or migration?
Yeah, Thank you so much, Metkal, for the question. So the question of the AFCFTA and regional integration, regional economic integration in Africa, we can look at it dating back again to the 1960s and why African states in the 1960s period had a different approach to integration than what they have now in the AFCFTA. So in the 1960s, they had a gradualist approach to integration. And that's why they agreed to create multiple sub-regional groupings that will feed into forming an African, one African trade agreement at the end of the day. Now we're taking a different approach. We have scrapped that out, but we didn't actually do that. They're still there. And we decided to go top down. So we had a bottom up. It's still there. We have not scrapped it out because the structure is already there and the institutions are there. And we've decided to start top down. And with the top down approach that we have adopted in the AFCFTA, in my thinking, is just an adaptation of very neoliberal policies that advocate for trade liberalization at any cost. Meaning like the compensation system to think about the losers and the winners of the market. We have not fully, there is a variable geometry in it that would allow countries that are less capable to gradually liberalize their economies. But my problem with it is that it might not even be implemented at all, given the fact that we've been trying to integrate economically for years and we have not gotten there. So if you look at the 1960s, for me, African states decided to do first political integration. Political independence of member states was at the core. And then they looked at economic integration as a subset of political integration. Now we are flipping it upside down. We want economic integration to be the core, and then other concerns will trickle down, like human rights will come from it. So we've decided to emulate the European Union conception of regional integration. And in my thinking, again, that kind of erases the emancipatory aspect of regional integration that we've had in Africa for years. The whole history of the formation of SADC has to do with anti-apartheid resistance in Southern African states. So if we are going to measure success of an integration based on whether we have moved from a free trade agreement to a customs union, meaning like if we have done more liberalization, we're not really measuring integration in its fullest sense. We're just focusing on classical development theories, neoliberal development theories, and ignoring human development, human well-being in our measure. I would like to see a more rounded emancipatory aspect to integration. And for me, the AFCFTA is not there yet. I don't know if it will get there, but at the moment, its formulation is similar to what we've seen in the EU. I know the EU has worked for Europe, but it took a while for the EU also to start putting concerns of human rights on the table. It was a pure economic integration scheme. Our way should not necessarily be what the EU has done. We've done this in the 1960s. We have the system. We have fought against European colonists for our independence, and we created an emancipatory integration scheme in the African Union. So let's promote the emancipatory aspect of it and broaden that emancipatory aspect to include all forms of emancipatory movements that exist in the continent, whether it's women's rights or minority rights and other concerns as well, not just trade. And that way we'll have a fully rounded development. Sorry, I'm a leftist and it's coming out very well.
So basically, the free trade agreement or area is not in a sense representing norms of solidarity of like the Africanness that as you perceive it, or how you theorize it, or would you say it goes against? Because to come also to climate migration, exactly, we have now free trade, as well, the free movement of goods, but not the free movement of people. Or on the other hand, you still have, to some degree, you saw that, for example, countries like Uganda, where Africans can travel to without any visa prior issued. So, what do you think of this? So, is this approach against your theory of norms of solidarity, or would you say the other approach would make more sense to stick to that, also considering the climate challenges that Africa faces?
So definitely, you can say the AFCFTA, given the fact that all except one country have signed into it, you can say that it's African states speaking with one voice. And there is the free movement protocol that is attached to it. But again, it's a privilege to be able to travel with a passport and cross borders. The kind of free movement that we should be speaking about is the right to establishment. So if I, as an Eritrean, was to travel to Ethiopia and be able to reside and establish my business and work there, or rather it's me going as a tourist, those are two different concepts. And right now our emphasis, at least in the legal consensus, have mostly been on free movement, meaning like I am able to travel to Ethiopia and go back to Eritrea, not necessarily to reside and work there. Even though there are protocols, especially ECOWAS has done significantly better than any other region when it comes to free movement of people. But at the African level, I think we're still at the African Union level, our conception of free movement of people is not limited in text, but has been limited in implementation. Linking the AFCFTA to my work, so I have other piece that I'm working on trying to see gender parity and how women's emancipation movements have moved from 1960s all the way up to here, and how they've been either included or excluded in Africa's integration schemes, including the AFCFTA. To a certain degree, if you look at our instruments, they are patriarchal. They're written with a certain interesting aspect that has practically excluded women from positions, especially at the early stages of the African Union. You don't really see women coming to positions of power. Even now, we can count the women who have risen to be the presidents of the African Union with one hand, right? So taking that and I look at 3 countries for that work. I look at women's rights movements in Nigeria from 1960s all the way up to present in Eritrea. And I look at South African women's movements and try to see how they have actually been included, or how they have been spoken about in negotiations. And most of the time at the African Union level, most of the concerns of women are seen as either mothers or vulnerable communities, but not necessarily as people who represent more than half of the population of the continent. So how do we move the conversation beyond to include communities that have been excluded from the system or have had limited access to the system to be part and parcel of that integration project? And it's not like women did not contribute to the independence movement of their home countries. They have. It's just the post-independence system just tends to be male-centric. And we've seen men presence for so many years in so many countries. It's not that there aren't women who are capable of leading their home countries. It just has not happened. So I ask myself, okay, what went wrong? And how did the women's movement themselves feel about this in the 1960s? Where did they promote independence and decide to hold off their social emancipatory movements? Right? So they are also conflicting within themselves. They decided, they thought, seek political freedom first, like what Nkrumah said, and everything else will be added onto you. And that was the approach that a lot of African countries took, a lot of women took in the 60s and all the way to the present. So they tend to think of their concerns as concerns of a group rather than of concerns of the state or the country or the continent at large. So in terms of norms of solidarity, looking just, for instance, at concerns of women and the AFCFTA, the AFCFTA recently decided to include a protocol of women, but they're calling it protocol of women and youth. So it just is not about women. And the way it was negotiated, they invited women from each African country. Imagine like to be represented by one woman for the whole country. Women traders, it focuses on women traders, but we have different personalities and we are beyond traders. We are teachers. Our concerns cannot be summed up by only traders. So I would like to see a broader conversation at the domestic level that could build all the way up to the continent rather than this negotiation happening at the continental level where we're having it is like one woman representing the interests of 1.5 million Eritreans, assuming that Eritreans are just 3 million people. It just doesn't make sense in basic democratic sense. I don't know. For me, it doesn't. So I'm struggling to align top-down approach and bottom-up approaches and how they interact with norms of solidarity. So I don't know if that makes sense or answers your question.
It does very much. Yes, there's Clement. He wants to ask a question. Yes, please, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Clement Lungunju. I'm connected from France. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Management and Organization. I'm sorry because I just joined you later and I was in another meeting. I'm sorry, I have missed some important point. I've got a comment. Thank you very much, Luan, for that wonderful presentation and for your project. It's quite interesting. I would like to find out, when I just hear about what you was talking about, climate-based immigration in African context, the debate around all of this, it's like you focus your analysis in a state level, while ignoring the other important actors, stakeholders, such as a private sector. What role the private sector can play, civil society. It's like but we're turning around state and between state and so on. I didn't hear it catch what role the private sector or other civil society can play in managing that phenomenon. And then and also, when talking about the policy, you mentioned that there's no common policy among the countries. But I think that's not only the problem of having common policy, but also the issue within every country. There's a kind of uncertainty in the policy, not only because there's no common, but each country doesn't have a kind of certain clear policy. And also beyond this, and also issue of barriers, of bureaucratic barriers, that some actors may play a role like private sector are facing. I think all these have to be considered not on at a state level, but have to go and look at what else, and how we can include them. and at every country, what is the policy and how those policy consistent, and then before we move to see a common and national, as you said, we have to start by domestic before we go up, and then domestic, what are the issues? I think at the level that bottom level, issue have to be addressed before we move up to regional, of national, regional, of continental level. So these are my two preoccupation. I would like you to focus on one aspect of kind of including other stakeholders, other actors, not only limited state analysis, but also looking at civil society, but also look at the policy uncertainty and all of bureaucratic barrier within the country. I don't know what you should react on this observation. It's a question of observations. So what you should say about these two observations?
Well, thank you so much, Clement, for coming first, and thank you for the comments. So I think I'm struggling with my profession being state-centered. Like in international law, the subjects of international law are states. So because I speak in my work to international law lawyers, and that's where I plan to publish in international law journals. So my focus has mostly been on states in that way, but I do recognize the deficiencies of just focusing on states. Maybe down the line after tenure, that's something I can pursue and write up on. But I do recognize that by focusing on states, where is the individual? Where is the private companies that have been working in this, or the civil societies? So that is what is informing my approach to focus on states rather than on private actors or civil societies or even community organizations. I look at the experiences of community organizations to look how they have dealt with the law, not necessarily how they have formulated a policy that at the local level. I might look at a policy that ends up becoming a law that started at the domestic level. But the fact that the laws that I'm looking at are state specific kind of limits me in terms of my audience, meaning like international legal scholars, how and where I can engage in that area. But down the line post tenure, that's something I hope to explore.
Any further questions?
You are on mute, Clement.
Hello, yeah, I was asking to Metcalf, if there's still time, I can ask another question. If there's opportunity.
Yes, of course. We have still some few minutes left, yes.
Oh, okay, yeah. When I look at the title, it's more talking about the solidarity, which is actually close to the more common African philosophy, which is Ubuntu that you mentioned, and then this Ubuntu. And I would like to find out, when you look at the legal perspective or at the state level, analyze of Ubuntu itself as a philosophy, as African philosophy, values, how this is manifested, how this is manifested. It's like this solidarity is manifested only within the state or just state discourse, but it is not embedded in the communities. Because what we have assistant is the reality within African countries, there's not kind of such solidarity. What we are talking about solidarity doesn't exist, even though. So I don't really understand. I left Africa for a couple of years, and I don't really feel what happens with xenophobia when we see. So this Ubuntu, this solidarity is not really manifested. What happened? The conflict, we really don't manifest that solidarity, that Ubuntu in a community. This is not embedded in African communities. It is at a national state level. It is So would that explain to me a little bit where really this is manifested in the practices? Because this may have a different perspective, or both that there's so if you would like to tell me a little bit solidarity in relation to the concept of African philosophy, which is Ubuntu.
Okay, thank you, Clement. So I don't work on, to start with, I don't work on Ubuntu, but I will tell you how I look at it, how I look not at Ubuntu, but at norms of solidarity and where it works at times at the domestic level as well, or at the people level, not just at the state level. Is that something that might be of interest?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just looking at norms of solidarity, for instance, when 3,000 Ethiopians migrated to Sudan because of the Great Famine, the Sudanese people housed and helped and supported people that are coming across the border, not just the Sudanese state, but the people also played a role. Yeah, what happened with xenophobia is another thing, meaning it's awful. But the people, South African people, during the apartheid struggle, they were housed, they were supported. The ANC, the PAC, their independence movements, they were supported financially, socially, economically by not just African states, but by African people as well. The Eritrean independence movement that I'm familiar with personally was supported not just by Eritreans that were abroad, but by people of African descent who decided to contribute to that independence movement, so, and also allies who are not necessarily people of African descent. So there is people-to-people solidarity that goes beyond my work on norms of solidarity. I look at states, again, because of my audience, but even within states, if you look at how African states vote in the recent Ukraine-Russia UN debate, the way African states are voting, the way they decide to abstain, these are material concerns. It's not about ideational concerns. If it's about principle and ideational concerns, they should stand up against aggression, right? But they're considering what that would mean in terms of their geopolitics with Russia and other allies, whether it's China or the United States or other Western countries. So we've, at the state level, I try to see how they voted, how they have negotiated, how they have put a reservation on a treaty, like if there's an agreement, but they can put a reservation. That is a voice that they're putting out either as a group or individually. And most of the time when African countries negotiate, for instance, a few years back in COP meetings, a few African countries would represent the whole continent. Like imagine if South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and Ethiopia were to represent Africa. Their concerns are not the same as the concerns of Lesotho. Definitely, Lesotho and South Africa will have different concerns, right? Eritrea and Ethiopia have been fighting for a while. Eritrea's concerns are not necessarily going to be the same as Ethiopia's concerns. So how do we make sure that when we send a few or one country to represent the whole continent, they speak with the voice that they've been given, with the mandate that we as a continent have given, rather than them representing their interests? So what ends up happening is one country can go with 54 more votes, but in actuality, it's just promoting their interest. And they might add some of African interest, but the first goal is to promote their interest. This is because they're also sponsoring the negotiators for that event that negotiate on behalf of Africa. So this is, at the end of the day, a resource question why Lesotho is unable to send someone to represent it. For my dissertation, I looked at trade agreements, and I can tell you the number of trade negotiators that we as a continent are able to send to represent us are a few. We can't either afford them or we don't have the skills internally to be able to represent ourselves. and that would mean that if you're being represented by someone else, they might not necessarily fully understand your concerns in a way that you would want to be represented. I know this doesn't respond to your question. It's just a side opinion that I had could fall potentially within your question.
Thank you very much, Luam.
Welcome.
Luam, I have one question regarding your approach to the topic and the idea that states are going to be prioritizing their national state interests, their economic interests first and foremost, as to how they vote and so on. So this seems to echo in international relations theory, the classical theories of realism, of neoliberalism. You've addressed that earlier, and so on. But from a theoretical angle, could there be something that we can learn from your study that actually is distinct from those classical theories, the way that states are behaving, or is it just a reflection of how classical theorists have talked about why states behave the way they do and why they prioritize survival, their own state interests, security dilemma, minimizing security risk, and so on as their priorities. But from your research on theorizing state behavior and from the Africanist angle, so is there a different angle from which we can perceive this topic?
Thank you so much, Adila. So in my in the article that was published, I looked at rationalists and also constructivists and tried to understand state behavior and why and how states behave towards each other. So the conclusion that I came from that work was that state behavior is, at least in the African level, and particularly in South African level, was a combination of both. It's not either. And I don't think that to be a novel argument, given that Amitav Acharya and Martha Finmore and Catherine Skink and others have written significantly on this. What I would say my contribution is, none of these people have looked at law and tried to historicize how that law has played a role in state behavior among African states. And that's where I think I'm adding value to what is already out there. But I guess it's for everyone who's reading to judge that. But that's the motivation that I have as I write. This is an area that I have skills that can transfer to look at it from a legal perspective and build on it and speak to legal scholars at the same time who are involved in drafting those instruments and hopefully eventually effect change. And does that respond to your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And yes, indeed, from a legal perspective, that's a very important contribution, because otherwise it's very state-centric. Yes, international law is very state-centric, but when we theorize state behavior from a legal dimension, there is not significant, there's not much contribution yet to the field. So Luam, I look forward to reading more of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adila. Thank you, Luam. Is there one last question maybe that anyone would like to ask? We have to round it up and finalize this webinar. So
Bruno's hand is raised.
yeah,
Yeah.
Bruno, yes.
Yes, thank you. I was looking where I could raise my hand, like on Zoom, but okay, my real hand is raised. So I'm Bruno Noisette. I'm assistant professor at BSB, which is a business school in France. And I studied African businesses, mostly in Rwanda, during my dissertation. And I've been interested in norms of social exchange, which are not really norms of solidarity, but which are, of course, closed just based on the label. And I will go back to Clement's question earlier, because it made me think about that. Basically, there are two dimensions. Like hearing you discuss about this question made me realize that there are two dimensions which are, I think, important in analyzing solidarity or exchange in African countries versus European countries or other cultures. One is the norms of social exchange at the dyad level, like how two entities or two individuals, but maybe two entities exchange. Do they share or not share? Do they count what they exchange or not? And how do they count it? And that, I think, works across levels of analysis, at the state level, at the group level, between states and groups, between individuals and groups. But also there is question of level of analysis. And I think that's, I mean, everybody kinds of had this in mind when we speak about Western versus non-Western cultures, collectivism. Do people exchange with groups or with individuals? But I think it's not robust enough and not explicit enough, this kind of ideas we have in mind when studying exchange across cultures. And I think, Clement, you would be interesting in thinking about this duality. Like, do we speak about the norm that regulates exchange, or do we think about, or do we study the kind of entity that exchange? Is it a state, a group, or an individual? And that, I think, will kind of solve explain why Clement and Wam were not able to discuss as efficiently as they could have. I don't know if it makes sense. It's very blurry, still very blurry.
Thank you so much, Bruno. I will take that comment as is and think about it, not because it's blurry. I don't think it's blurry. The question of norms of social exchange, and to think about it in terms of norms of solidarity. Where is that happening? Is it at the state level and at the entity level, or at the individual level? I think that's interesting. I will look into it. I'm actually not familiar with that area of work, and it's something that I will try. I will make an effort to look at and see if I can learn and implement.
So I actually had the issue during my dissertation because I was looking at relationship between family members, but also at relationship between firms and families as groups. And family, what is it? Is it a network of people, or is it a group? And I used Alan Fisker's norms of exchange theory, and it helped me a lot. So I don't know if it's, if you don't know the literature, it can be worth looking at it. Very, very simple, very clear.
Yeah, thank you. That will be helpful. I'll just send you my email address so you can send it to me. Is that okay?
Perfect. Thank you again, Luam. That was very insightful and very interesting. There are many questions. There are still very many, many questions that we can discuss. And I believe it was for everyone, also considering how we had the opportunity to discuss your presentation. I believe, I hope you also had an insightful discussion and also something that you can take with you. And yeah, I would like to thank also Emamdine and Adila and Amar for everything and for preparing this lecture. And see you next time, I guess. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Luam.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.